Welcome to the Pen to Publish podcast from the two Alexas. If you're planning to pen and publish or are penning at the moment, then you're definitely in the right place. We talk all about the writing and publishing process, and we know this podcast is helping hundreds of writers all over the globe. I'm Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher. And
I'm Alexa Tewksbury, author, editor, and proofreader. We have many writing resources for you, including our brand new Pen to Published website, where you can get all the show notes and guest information. We've interviewed some really interesting writers and authors, and there's also our Writers Refinery Facebook group, which is available for you to join. We love getting feedback, so do please leave us a review, and don't forget to hit subscribe so that all the latest episodes pop up in your podcast feed. So let's get started.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Pen to Publish podcast. And today we are going to be speaking to Louise Harnby. Now, Louise is a professional fiction editor with 30 years publishing experience and specializes in working with independent crime, thriller, and mystery writers. Oh, my favorite.
Mine too.
She is
murder.
Love a bit of murder. She is an advanced professional member of the Chartered Institute of Editing and Proofreading, CIEP, and co-hosts the editing podcast with Denise Cowell. Find out more about her courses, books, and services at harnby.co/fiction-editing. But we will also put all of your information on your own guest page, which is on the pen2publishpodcast.com page, or what were the show notes, but now we've got a fancy website. Ooh. So, Louise, welcome to the show.
Yes, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's so lovely to be here.
It's lovely to talk to another podcast host as well. I'm sure you've come across some challenges with your podcast. Have you come across any challenges, or are you...
I would say the biggest challenge we've had, well, especially at the beginning, was chilling out, just remembering it doesn't need to be perfect.
Oh, yeah.
You know, it doesn't. With the first, I think Denise and I always laugh because the first episode we did, I think we recorded about 7 times because one of us tripped over words, and rather than just going, stop that, pause it, either leave it in or take it out,
edit it out,
whatever. And so the challenge has been around us, I think, not the actual sort of delivery of the content. But is that something?
Oh, my word. It is a common thread with authors as well, isn't it? Authors want the perfect book. And how many times do we say, Alexa, there is no such thing as a perfect book? People hide behind perfectionism. It's why we stop doing things, isn't it? We talked about this very subject last week with Rebecca Cole. You know, I'm a creative and I love doing stuff, but I've stopped doing arty stuff because I'm afraid of getting it wrong, which is stupid.
And also starting, sometimes people are afraid to start. For instance, someone gave me this isn't to do with writing or anything, but someone gave me a tea cozy knitting kit, probably about 5 years ago. It was before the pandemic. It's still sitting under my bed because every now and then I get it out and then I think, but I might do it wrong.
Yes.
And, you know, rather than thinking, well, I could just unpick it and do it again.
Yeah. And I'll learn. You know, that's the thing, isn't it? It's a journey sometimes.
Yes.
And it's the part of the experience is about making those mistakes and then deciding, well, are they mistakes or are they just a question of my style and the way I do things? Can I improve it next time? Do I need to worry about it this time? You know, life's short.
Exactly. Yes. And actually podcasts that have this sort of, I mean, I don't think we've ever professed that our podcast is perfect or particularly professional, because it's just us chatting about all things publishing. And when we have guests on, we like it when we go off track, where we go off a tangent. It doesn't matter, you know, at the end of the day.
What does it matter if somebody stumbles over a word or, you know, or doesn't know the answer to a question? That happens. The thing I really love about your podcast and some other ones that are favourites of mine is that they're just that they sound real, that it's people chatting. It's not this sort of, it's not a webinar, you know. It's a conversation. So
it's not highly produced, basically. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love a crime podcast, and there are some out there that are brilliant. I mean, I don't know if you've been listening to or watching Uncanny when we're talking about
I haven't yet. But...
Oh, God, it's so brilliant. And that's very highly produced. But, he's working at the BBC. It's got to be.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's different, isn't it? It's like, and this is, I think the podcasting is very much like novel creation these days. The former gatekeepers are not there. If you want to do it in your living room or your home office or your bedroom, you can do. If you've got all the tech and you want to highly produce and you've got the money to do that and the time, you can do. But it's quite democratic in that sense that everybody can have a go. And it's pretty affordable. And
like self-publishing. I mean, this is exactly what self-publishing has done to the fiction world, isn't it? And this non-fiction is the fact that you don't have to go through this really rigid, expensive, almost cliquey way of going through a professional, publishing body. I know there are some people out there, that's what the route they want to go down. And I'm not taking away from someone that's been professionally published, but self-publishing has opened up the field, hasn't it?
Yeah.
And
totally.
It's
democratized it, I think. And also, just because you've got an established gatekeeper doesn't mean that they've always got the capacity or the will to publish content that is of interest to people, but it just might not fit. And so now, with whether it's audio or with novels or how-to books, people have got ideas that maybe a gatekeeper, for want of a better word, might not be interested in, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't be out there.
No, exactly. No. Exactly.
And here we all are.
Here we are. Exactly. So let's rewind a little bit, Louise, and find out a little bit more about you. So how did you get into editing then? Were you an avid reader when you were a kid? Is this something that you always sort of felt like when you were at school, you kind of knew this is the direction you were going to go into? Did you love books from an early age? How did you fall into the editing role that you're in now?
So a little bit by accident, I left university and didn't have a clue what I wanted to do. Had a good time there, but didn't have a clue what job I was going to do. Quite fancied what a careers advisor there sort of like said, I can see you in advertising or something like that. Or anyway, I applied for jobs and I actually worked in publishing after leaving uni, but I was on the marketing side of the business. And I had a wonderful time and I learnt loads. And I met people from different departments, from editorial production to design to commissioning to people actually delivering the stuff in the post room, the whole process. And then in 2003, I had a child and I found myself wanting a career that was flexible enough to allow me to work from home and bring up my kid. And so I decided on a sideways move. And so I retrained and set up my own editing business. Yeah, I love books. I've always been a big reader, and even from an early age growing up in our house, walls were stacked with them, and now my own place is the same. And I find reading really helps me relax and enter someone else's world for a little while. But I didn't have designs on this. And the other thing I think is that in some ways editing is a very different matter from
reading,
absorption and reading because we need it to be on it rather than relax. But I think it's similar in terms of the immersion. So when I'm editing a book, I feel like I'm entering the world of that story, and it's just that I'm coming at it with a more critical eye so that I can help my author give their readers the very best experience and help those readers relax into that space in the same way that I do when I climb under my duvet at night and pick up my whatever I'm reading at the moment.
And do you read a lot? I mean, I know, Alexa, sometimes you struggle a bit with reading, obviously, because especially if you've been reading all day. Are you able to shut off then from your work to reading a novel? Are you able to sort of switch without not knowing it? Editing, yes.
Yeah, I am. I tend to read before I go to bed at night. Find it helps me sleep. And if I've got a spare few hours and the sun's out, I'll sit in my back garden and read. And sometimes I might see something and I think, that would be a really good example as a teaching tool. And I might just quickly take a photo of something so to remind me to go back to it or make a note of it. But if I see something that sort of with my editorial eye, I might be sort of critiquing, I slap myself on the wrist and say, stop it. It doesn't matter. You're not here to do that. You're here to enjoy this story. So yeah, pretty much I can.
Well, we've talked a bit about the Chartered Institute of Editing and Proofreading on the podcast before, and the benefits of hiring an editor from the directory that's associated with the Chartered Institute. But could you just explain a bit more about what the Institute does and the standards that it upholds? Because I know that, for a lot of authors, it's very helpful to them to be able to see that this person has had training and this person has this experience and they are a member of this body, because it gives them confidence in that editor.
I think you've nailed it. I mean, so the CIEP is first and foremost a membership organisation. I think it's important to make that clear. It exists because of its members, for its members, and it's governed by its members. And even when it acquired its royal seal, its charter, that underpinning reason for its existence remained. And that's not to say the charter isn't important. It is. It's really important. And this sort of comes on to your question, Alexa, because there are 4 goals or what it calls objects that the Institute's obliged to focus on. And those are about public awareness, or raising public awareness about the value of good editorial work, sharing information about editorial work and what it is, what it means, the different types of editing, promoting professionalism, and being an authority when it comes to those standards, that training, that teaching and research into the field. And the standards element is critical, precisely what you alluded to there, because editing isn't like the law or medicine or midwifery or accountancy, is it? You don't need accreditation to practice. And that means anyone can say they're an editor. And I think this can be a real problem in a world where so many authors are now their own publishers. I mean, we were talking just a minute ago about how democratizing the world of publishing has become now that people can do it themselves. And so when an author's hiring editorial support, they need to have some way of making, or several ways of making, judgments about the editors they work with. And CIEP membership is one way in which they can do that. Not the only way, but it's one way. And I think the key here is that the CIEP has a graded membership structure. So to call yourself a professional or an advanced professional member and to advertise in that directory, you need to have carried out training. You need to be able to demonstrate hours on the job. You need to be able to supply references from people who themselves are knowledgeable enough to assess the value of your work. And so this issue of standards, I agree. It's about upholding the profession and encouraging practicing editors to learn and develop their skills. But it's also about protecting clients and giving them confidence in who they're hiring. Very much so. Yeah.
I think that's important, to have some kind of regulation on a non-regulated
I mean, to be fair, we are not the only editorial society that does that. 2 other examples just off the top of my head are Editors Canada and the Institute of Professional Editors based in Australia. So IPED and EC also have various ways of enabling members to signal their professional abilities and competencies. And I do think it's really valuable. You can't just hand over your subs money to the CIEP, all those other 2 organisations, and say, now I want to advertise in the directory and tell the world that I'm a member. You have to demonstrate that you're.
So as an editor, because I'm not an editor, as I always say, very much not an editor, because I can't spell toffee. So when you join, do you have to then... Are you sort of given a test? Are you given tests then?
There are various routes. So you can do a test. There's an editorial test. You can also acquire points for particular types of core skills training, what we call core skills training. So that'll be your foundational copy editing or proofreading skills. Something that some of our members struggle with is that sometimes if they've come in through, let's say you'd worked in-house in a publishing company for years, perhaps as a fiction editor, and you've never had reason to learn core copy editing or proofreading skills, but now you're freelance and you do a lot of structural or developmental editing because you know that stuff. It's your bread and butter, and so those members can find themselves in a situation where they haven't got the right training in order to be able to qualify, get enough points to raise up to the next membership level. So that's why the editorial test was introduced, to enable people to do that instead. And the institute's in a process of change at the moment, and the professional development manager and the CEO are looking at how we might expand, or it's just at exploration stage, but it's how else can we make it so that more people who are competent editors, how do we make it so that they can join us? Another thing we're doing is we're making sure that, so currently we've got an editorial test, but it's written in British English. So we want, the next step is to have one that's US English, so that people aren't tripping up on little points because they don't happen to know the sort of little nuances that are different. And then we're looking at also doing a Canadian test and an Indian English test. And so there's lots of ways in which we can increase accessibility globally for members as well. So, I mean, I don't work just for British authors just because I live in Britain. I'd say about 60% of my client base is based in the States. So I am comfortable working in American English or British English, but some people aren't. Their client base is sort of more regionally localized, and so we don't want to exclude them on those grounds. So there's more we can do.
Mm. And when you started, because you specialize in fiction, you were saying you specialize in crime and all that sort of juicy stuff.
Lovely.
When you started, what made you choose to specialize in fiction rather than non-fiction? Because when I started, well, I'd been working for quite a while before I came across your book, Marketing Your Editing and Proofreading Business, which is where I found out about the Chartered Institute, which was at that time, it was operating under a different name. And I found out about the courses, and I just found out how to increase my skills and my competence, I suppose. And I know that in there you do advocate specializing, being a specialist in something. And whilst I do specialize in children's fiction, I'm always afraid to just say that's what I do, because there are always opportunities will crop up for different things, non-fiction and adult fiction as well.
So a couple of things, I suppose I might not have articulated myself well enough in that book, but just to sort of deal with that specialization point first, I always say you should talk like a specialist. Whether you behave like a generalist is quite another matter. But so when you're communicating with people via, say, you're writing I don't think it comes back down to your bio necessarily. So I think you can do lots of different things if you want to. But I think when it comes to marketing, writers are more likely to engage. The kind of writers I want to work with are more likely to engage with me because I'm saying to you, I'm into what you write is what I'm into editing. It's what I'm into reading. This is your wheelhouse. This is my wheelhouse. But that doesn't mean that if somebody came to me and said, look, I know I can see you do crime stuff, but I've got something it's like leading sort of slightly more to women's literary fiction, but it does have a murder in it. It's
cozy crime, would you say?
Although I would consider that, but if it's definitely sort of more of a relationship focused novel, say perhaps, or if it was, if the crime wasn't maybe the sort of the
star of the show,
I might still consider it if I liked what I was seeing. On the whole, I think it's very hard to market yourself as a generalist. I mean, you can go broad. You can say I'm a specialist fiction editor, or and then you don't have to be. Yeah, Andy Hodges, a colleague of ours, specializes in sci-fi and fantasy anthropology.
Right.
So when people come to his website, I mean, and it's interesting because actually that's not as disparate as it might sound, given the world building elements. But when people come to his website, they can find out about those core things that he's interested in. He's showing that he gets those things. So yes, a veterinary surgeon probably isn't going to hire him, but someone might hire him to do translating work, because I think he's also fluent in Croatian. So people will hire him for that. They'll hire him maybe to look at anthropological stuff. They'll hire him for sci-fi or help with world building. So I think if you're canny about it, you can specialize in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. But actually, I didn't even start out as a fiction editor.
Oh.
I worked for a social science publisher for years, and I have a degree in political science. And so when I set up my business, that's where I started, with the social sciences, because that's what I knew. But then a few years went by and I gradually acquired more and more fiction clients, and I just loved that work, especially the line craft element of it, helping authors really elevate their sentences so that the reader's engaged in that nitty-gritty stuff. And then when I noticed that there wasn't a huge amount of information about line craft for authors and editors available online or in the established training courses, not for fiction anyway. A lot of the stuff I was seeing tended to be focused on the bigger picture, like story level stuff, or further down the end of the line of the production process. So I started writing blogs and books and courses to address that. And that's been wonderful because there's no better way to learn than to teach it. But
I have, for people listening, I seem to have a whole library of Louise Harnby's books, and I'm just holding up one, which obviously you can't see because you're just listening, but it's called Editing Fiction at Sentence Level, a guide for beginner and developing writers, and it's also invaluable for editors. Louise Harnby she's like a kind of a fount of knowledge, but just like a sort of guru that you can go to.
Oh,
if you
well, that's nice of you to say that.
Well, no, but that's really interesting that you say you started off in the social sciences, because your knowledge now of how to write, the sort of the technicalities of how to write fiction is just amazing. I would encourage anybody listening to go and look at Louise's website, because she has resources for editors, so much information for editors to help them improve their work. And incidentally, some of those courses will give editors points when they're hoping to upgrade their membership of the Chartered which you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
But she also has so many resources for writers, and some of them are free. You can just go there and just take what you want. And that's really what I wanted to talk about next. Sorry, I kind of interrupted you then.
No, that's all right.
Of your books.
Thank you for mentioning it, Alexa. I mean, all I'll say is that was me bringing together that stuff that I felt was missing in one place. You know, there's some excellent fiction editing books out there. I wanted to write the book that I wished had been around when I decided, because I don't do structural editing or developmental editing. My love is with the sentence. It was about creating the book that I wished had been around when I was first learning. And obviously it took many years to bring together the content for that. But I just kept thinking more about what makes that sentence work. Why is that so magic right there? What's that author done? You know, I looked at a lot of mainstream authors, and I know we're going to talk about some aspects of linecraft in a minute, but I just kept looking at bits and just untangling it and thinking, yes. But yeah, you know.
I think I need to get that book. I've started writing a fiction book. I mean, it's been in the works for the last 3 years, I think. And I feel like it can't be this easy, because, you know, I find writing quite easy. And I know, having looked at badly written books and having looked at really, really good books that I enjoy and just are so easy to read because they're so well written, but they don't feel well written, because it's effortless. It seems
that's right.
You know,
it's like you have to kind of unpick what isn't there.
Yes.
If it was, it would spoil it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think I'm going to need to go and get that book that Alexa Tewksbury's just shown, because I mean, I think my writings really are rather awesome, and who am I to write a book, right? So I'd love to get that book just to see what you're talking about, because you're right. It's the looking at it forensically, and you being able to say, right, it's because of this and this and this that makes it so good. And I think Alexa Tewksbury's going to ask the next question, which I know what it is, and I'm dying to know what the answer is.
But just to say, Alexa Whitten, that isn't it great sometimes just to have something validated, even if you don't learn something new, or you find out from something that, oh yeah, I already do that.
Yeah. I mean, I know what I hate. Yeah. And I have many of them. Because if you listen to the podcast, you know I've got pet peeves, and I've just discovered a new pet peeve, which I'm going to be talking about in the group on Friday. And I'm going to make sure I don't contradict myself and put in my pet peeves in my book. But you know, I'm really curious for the next question of how we get into the, where you get into this line level. There's more to it than just, putting a few words on a page. And I think first time writers don't appreciate the craft sometimes. And I think that's why this episode, I think, will be very, very valuable for first time writers to realize it's not just about putting a few words on a page. There's a little bit more to it than that.
Go on then. Hit me with this question.
Okay, well, I just thought it would be helpful to ask you about some specific things that would really benefit new fiction writers in particular, just to understand and to hear your tips for how to achieve them. I just picked a few things, but honestly, editing fiction at sentence level, everybody, if you buy this book, you'll find so much detail in there about the kind of things you need to be looking out for in your writing. Now, the first thing, a lot of the things that you write about, Louise, and the things that just, as I say, it's just a handful of things, but writers probably haven't even thought of. They haven't even considered it, because when we talk about reading a fiction book analytically, it's not necessarily analytical to that extent.
Yeah,
if you're looking at format and how the plot's constructed and that sort of thing. But there are these real technical things that make such a difference. So the first one is viewpoint. Now, because viewpoint isn't something that you just consider with first person writing. So if you're writing as I, it's for third person writing too. So what should writers look out for to get a smooth viewpoint?
Yeah. Oh, viewpoint's such a tricky thing. I think it's a real tricky thing for new fiction editors as well, but especially also for new or emerging writers. Not all of them, but some of them. So I guess I'd say my biggest tip is to make a decision about whose eyes and mind your reader is expected to experience the story through at a particular point in time, and to make sure that you hold that space in a way that the reader can navigate. And that means restricting what information readers can access. So let's say our viewpoint character is called Joe. And that means the reader can know what Joe sees and hears, but also internal stuff like what Joe thinks and feels and senses. And a non-viewpoint character, let's call her Louise, because why not, who's in that scene might also be able to hear and see the same things as Joe, but the reader won't know what she's thinking, what her emotions are, if we're sticking to that chosen viewpoint. So maybe a particular chapter will be through this one character's eyes, or maybe it's a section, or maybe it's a paragraph, but the reader shouldn't be trying to work out whose experience this is. And I think for new writers, it's best to hold that viewpoint perspective within a chapter or a section, because shifting viewpoint from one paragraph to another does take some skill.
Or the whole book, I might add. I mean, I think if you're a first-time writer, should it not be the whole book from one viewpoint?
It could be, or maybe just two characters. I mean, I think it depends how the story's constructed. It might be. I mean, certainly, yes. Perhaps if you're very inexperienced, then yes. But I was just going to say that if any of your listeners want to see some examples from an author who does that sliding really well from paragraph to paragraph, Mick Herron's Jackson Lamb series, Slow Horses and all that, is excellent. But my goodness, he's an experienced and skilled writer, and I think it's usually better to maintain a particular character within chapter, section, or entire book when you're learning your writing craft. So, summarizing, you're deciding who your viewpoint character is and acknowledging the restrictions or the limitations about what can be reported.
Depending on which viewpoint you're taking.
Depending on who that person is. And I think that's a really good thing to practice.
And would you say, I'm jumping in here and I'm sorry about that, Lee Child does this with his books. Some of his books are third person, so they're being described almost by a narrator in a way. So that he talks about Jack Reacher did this, Jack Reacher did that, as a really easy way of seeing the viewpoint.
Yeah.
And then some books, he's I did this, I did that. I did this next. So he changes depending on the book.
Yeah.
Would you say I struggle with books from an I point of view? Because if I don't like the person who's narrating the story, I'm not going to I struggle then to like the story. So would you say there is a better viewpoint to start out with? Or would you say it really doesn't matter, just go for it?
I would say for writing's hard enough, go with what you feel comfortable with. Personally, I love a first person narrative, although I suppose a good example, I'm pretty sure Bret Easton Ellis's American Psycho is written in first person. And now there's an unlikable character. And I take your point, but I think that the one thing about writing in first person is that it does force the writer to hold a viewpoint. I think actually where writers are much more likely to drop viewpoint and head hop when they're dealing with third person narrations, because a third person narration is essentially, just because you're using the pronouns he, she, or they, or whatever, doesn't mean that if you're
that you
writing,
jump from one character to another.
Yeah. Unless you're writing an omniscient, which, as we've talked about, is just don't do it if you're a new writer. That it's too hard.
Jane Austen's omniscient,
Yes,
isn't
and
she?
Dickens writes does a lot of omniscient writing masterfully. Thackeray did it with Vanity Fair. I mean, it works very well for satire, but I think for things like thrillers, it's very hard. Third person is probably a very common viewpoint to take. So in the book, in editing fiction at sentence level, I talk about the differences between third person objective and third person limited and third person omniscient, so that people can see what those limitations are. I suppose there's one particular narrative style that I wouldn't recommend in addition to omniscient, that I would recommend particularly the beginner author doesn't touch, and that's second person, because that's quite rare to see that done. And it's really hard because it's quite spooky as well.
And what is second person?
The second person would be, you walked into the room, you took off your clothes.
My goodness.
It's voyeuristic almost.
Right. Okay. So you're almost like reading as though the author is, the reader is it's like the reader is the character.
Yeah. It's very weird. Ian Banks played with it in one of his novels. I can't remember it. Well, not for the whole thing, but it feels quite voyeuristic and sinister. But anyway, just
stay clear of that for now.
There are other things to master before you try and do that.
As you mentioned, narrative distance. Shall we just explain what that is and why it's important to understand it? It's narrative distance, or it can be called psychic distance.
That's right. So you're right. It is a really great thing for the new writer to get their head around. So what we're talking about here is how close the reader feels to the character. To what degree are we in their mind? So if my viewpoint character is called Joe, and I write about how Joe hears his partner coming up the stairs and finds it hard to breathe, that's intimate. We've got access to Joe's mind. And so the psychic or narrative distance is close. And that helps us connect with him and care about him. It's like we are him. And that's all well and good. If then you bounce too quickly into another person's head, say in that example, the partner's, and have access to their thoughts, then the psychic distance is now close there too. And this is head hopping. And it feels like literary table tennis, and it forces the reader to stop being Joe for a moment and start being the partner. And then that puts the reader in this sort of weird omniscient position where they know what everybody's feeling line by line. And it's really hard to connect with anybody to be in the moment with a single character in a way it's intimate. Now, some writers can do it and they can pull it off, but it's not for the faint-hearted. And this relates back to viewpoint and deciding who your viewpoint character in. Whose brain do you want your reader's head to be in? And if it's everyone's, okay, go for it. Dickens was good at it. Heron's good at it, but it's hard. And so I think it's worth studying psychic distance and thinking about which character it's going to be close with and when. You don't have to have the same level of psychic distance. You can slide up and down a kind of, I always call it a continuum. So we were talking before about Lee Child and Jeffrey Deaver does this quite a lot as well. These authors, they might start off where the narrative distance is quite distant, and so they might refer to a character, a viewpoint character, and give their whole name. And the information that we're given makes the reader feel like they're standing quite far away and looking at, perhaps they're looking from a distance at that character emerging from a house, and it's very objective information. And then gradually we might sort of start to slide into a situation where we sense what that person's actually thinking, and then it becomes narrower or closer. And so you don't have to stay in the same place, but when you get that bouncing of close psychic distance, bang, bang, bang after another between different characters, it's just head hopping, and and
it's exhausting.
It's
for
exhausting
for a
and
reader. It's exhausting,
and it's a real telltale that perhaps
Mm.
the author doesn't quite understand the principles and the restrictions of viewpoint or the different types of narrative style. So, when you read Dickens or Heron, you don't sit there thinking like, most people don't understand viewpoint. You understand that they're writing sometimes from an omniscient perspective. It's a narrative choice. When it's just put on the paper and it's not a choice, it's a lack of understanding. I think that's when it starts to show. And as you said, Alexa, it can be exhausting and dissatisfying. So
and it jars. There's a children's rhyming book that I edited recently, and it was telling quite a long story in rhyme. And even in rhyme, within the same verse, it would suddenly go off to what the other characters were doing or think, and it just felt like, no, that doesn't. It jars.
Yes,
because
you've just got into that space where you're starting to like think, almost feel like you are that character, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, hang on, oh, we're doing something else now. It's just, yeah, it is.
Yeah.
It feels like you're being shoved around within the book rather than just able to sink into
Why do you think people write like that? Is it just because they either have had a break and come back to it and they suddenly are seeing things from their partner's point of view and not Joe? Or is it just the fact that they think that's how
I'll tell you what I think it is.
reading?
I think TV has a lot to do with it. So I've had some really good, in terms of the sort of story concept, I've had manuscripts like that come on, digital ones come on my desk, but there's been loads of head hopping like that. 9 times out of 10 that person has got experience as a screenwriter, and if you think about it, when you watch a thing on television, I mean, you're actually never in somebody's head. You're always looking objectively, but you do get that flip-flop between where you get to see sometimes, I don't know, so maybe the focus character is Joe, and then Stephen, whatever. Joe walks out of, and we're focused on him, and you can see all his sort of, you get it's all about him, and they're building up the backstory, and then he walks out of the room, and then there's some sinister music, and somebody turns around, and there's a slight look to camera when you make them, and you see something that he can no longer see, and I think what sometimes writers do is try to replicate in novel form that kind of bigger access you have on the screen to things, and that comes across in a novel form in this sort of head hopping way, only they add the thoughts in. And also I think that I don't know that this stuff is often taught in, like when you think of us, most of us learn to read at school and write at school. We write our first essays or fictional essays at school, and viewpoint's hard. It's as we said earlier, it's hard for some editors, and I think that sometimes it's often seen as, I think, a structural editing thing. So, and I actually do, it's definitely something you need to be aware of if you're a developmental editor, but that there is a danger then that if you specialize in line stuff and you haven't done any training in developmental editing, that was my concern when I wrote that book, that people wouldn't know what it was, and then people don't know to edit for it. I do think that TV might have something to do with it.
I think also it probably comes down to what Alexa's going to ask you next, is that people, I think, especially new writers, they want to tell everything. They want to put all the stuff, all the jam. They want to put all the jam in the jar. Everything. Yeah. Everything has to go in the jar really quickly, right at the beginning, stuff it all in. Yeah. And there's beauty in actually keeping stuff out of the jar, and I think that's what Alexa's going to ask you for tips on the next bit. I think
it's something that we've mentioned before, show versus tell, and I expect it's something that a lot of writers have heard of, but I thought it would just be really helpful to hear how you go about not telling everything but showing it, because readers don't want to be spoon-fed. And it can be irritating if you're reading something, think, well, I didn't need to know all that. Now you've spoilt it for me because I could have worked that out for myself or something. So how can writers avoid this? I often say to writers, if put more in dialogue and show the character through the dialogue and that kind of thing. Yeah. But what are your tips for avoiding that?
So I'm just going to maybe focus on 2 tips. So one thing that I noticed, and this is what Alexa Whitten said just now about not trusting the readers. So I always tell writers to watch out for too many filter words. So words that tell us how a character is experiencing something: saw, heard, thought, wondered, realized, felt, noticed, and so on. So, for example, let's go back to our viewpoint character Joe. Let's say Joe sees a car hurtling towards him. Maybe in that case, the reader doesn't need the sentence: Joe heard a car screeching around the corner and saw it hurtling towards him. Instead, the writer might say something like, a car screeched around the corner and hurtled towards him. It's like we lost about 5 words there. And that way the reader's focused on the screech and the hurtling car rather than on Joe's hearing and seeing those things. And sometimes just removing 1 or 2 filter words can make the prose feel so much more immediate for the reader. It's like they're there in the moment with the character rather than having to experience the action through the filter of the character's sentences, because the reader is capable of assuming that hearing and seeing were taking place. So I think that's something I noticed less experienced authors doing a lot. And I don't remove every single filter word I come to, because sometimes actually the whole point is to focus on that person's experiences of senses, particularly where hearing's concerned. But sometimes actually the author might want to show the reader that perhaps someone's incredibly distracted. They're looking at this and they're looking at that and then they're looking at that. That might be the point. But if actually it's not the point, if the point is what is happening to the character, then I think sometimes we can remove those. My second tip is related to that, and it's to actually, going back to viewpoints again, how might you show a viewpoint character's emotion rather than having it being told? So there's a video online somewhere in which Stephen King is talking to a class of young writers at some university, and he's talking about tissue rippers. And so what he's talking about there is how you can show that a character is bored or on edge by how they move, by what they do, rather than by telling the reader that they feel like that. So a character's fiddling with a tissue or a napkin would be a great way of showing that boredom or that anxiety. And then you don't have to head on and say that this non-viewpoint character is nervous. Or maybe you've got a character who's cold, but instead of telling the reader that, you show it by saying that they rubbed their arms or they blew into their hands. And it enables the reader to sort of get a sense of the scene and just not being told the whole time, like, what it is that person's experiencing, but allowing you to kind of absorb it through other information. I know our colleague Sophie Plale wrote something, Writing on a Slant, I think it was called, or something like that. But it's about how do you convey information on a slant? Not this is it, but like bring it in another way. And because it's about showing rather than telling what a character looks like or what kind of personality they have. So rather than writing a whole list of traits, which can sound like a shopping list.
Oh, it's awful.
Yeah.
I hate it when people do that.
Yeah.
It's like you don't need to do that. You can be very clever with describing someone's appearance, either in dialogue or in the clothes they wear, or perhaps they have to shave a couple of, perhaps the 5 o'clock shadow appears, in early evening. Right. Well, then we're already gathering that they've got a swarthy complexion. They're probably dark, and it's one of my pet peeves is when people give a list of characteristics when you're introducing a character. It's like, drip feed us. We don't need to know at the beginning if the guy's tall, short, thin, whatever. We don't need to know that, but you can, throughout the story, if he's always eating pasties and chips and chocolate bars and Coke, we probably can get an idea that, he's a bit bulky.
Or the whole point is that he's not, like someone might comment on the fact that, goodness me, the crap he shoves down his neck and look at him, he's really thin.
Yes.
Now, and that way you're sort of like creating that character's description in a way that's more nuanced and embeds it in that character's backstory. I was just thinking of another example. So, the shopping list route, you would say something like, Joe was a 25-year-old, 6'5" black man. But how mundane is that? But instead, if you were to say Joe was the only black guy on the force, and at 25, the youngest to make lieutenant. Nobody
Yes.
messed with him, probably because he was 6'5", or maybe it's because he'd been a pro wrestler in his previous life. Depending on the tone of it, you can make it a bit interesting, and now you know exactly what Joe looks like. But it's showing it through the narrative, or you could do it through dialogue too, rather than just like, doing it like a
Shopping
menu.
list.
And I know that was kind of like a blunt example, but I do see less experienced writers taking this shopping list approach, and so I do think it's worth, if that's you and you're listening to this, practice mixing things up a little, and like Alexa, like Witten said, be a little clever. See if you can be a little bit clever with it and craft that information in a way that helps the reader imagine and connect with a character and understand them a little bit better, or that helps you understand how others see that character. So is it other people talking about that person behind their back, or maybe they're even poking fun, or being
derogatory
about them, that you can. There's a lovely example of this I quote it in Editing Fiction and Sentence Level, I think. She has a character stand in front of a mirror and put on her favorite Chanel suit, and it's hanging off her, and it's a bit threadbare. And I can't remember exactly what she does, but through it, you realize that this woman's lost weight, that she's unhappy. Is this, and it's old, she's lost money, or there's a few short sentences about this woman's appearance, but she shows so much more than she tells you through that, and it's just a really cracking example. So,
and then going into dialogue then. Because again, this is probably one of my biggest bugbears when people write. I mean, I've always said you can take a crappy book and make it good with good dialogue. But on the flip side of that, you can take a cracking book and make it really crap with a bad dialogue, I think. So what mistakes do you notice writers making, and how can they fix them with dialogue? Because we talk about this, Alexa, don't we, all the time? And I don't know if people just think their book doesn't fall into this trap. But what would you say? Because it's probably the biggest bugbear both of us have is bad dialogue.
Again, something we could talk about all day, isn't it? But I'm just going to give 2 tips for today. And the first is to look at whether the dialogue is driving the story forward, or is it mundane? So, like, what I find is that sometimes some of my less experienced authors try to replicate real life. Problem is, the way people speak in real life is really dull to read in a novel. Like, if you were to put a transcript out now of this, and with us wittering on and making little jokes here and there, you might, that wouldn't make for a novel. It's fine as a transcript, but there's some of it's
just too mundane.
Yeah.
Do you want a cup of tea? Yeah.
So, well, that was exactly what I was going to write. So you imagine you've got 2 characters in a cafe, and in reality, it's like they'd be a conversation about who wants what drinks and how many sugars and whether they take milk. And usually that stuff isn't driving the story forward, is it? And so just let the reader assume that they sorted all their stuff out like that, rather than putting it down the page. Like dialogue. So John Yorke called dialogue characters in action. Like, when a character says something, it's important as the narrative around it. And it should exude voice and mood and intention. And if it can't do any of those things, then it probably doesn't need to be in there, or it needs reworking. So, it doesn't matter if all the stuff in real life that would have happened before that because people are polite or whatever. I mean, even hello. When people answer the phone in a book, I don't need to hear that, hello, how are you? Yes, it would happen in real life, but just cut it out and get to the chase. Readers are used to that. They're used to not having everything in, everything that a person might say in real life. They're used to speech in a dialogue not being authentic, because that's not what you're looking for. You're not looking to replicate real life. You're looking. This is an art form within a novel. So,
it's like with a stage play, like we talk over each other, because I might think that you finished. In fact, I think I did it just then, I might think you finished and I'll start talking before you finished. But if you did it in a stage play, it wouldn't work. You want to pick up your cue quickly, but you don't want to be talking over the end of the person's speech. So that's not how we might have a conversation in real life, but it's how it needs to be for that art form.
Yes. You need space, don't you? Everybody needs the space to say the things that they need to say in order to drive the story or the play forward, or otherwise it's just people will start to skim. That's the danger.
That's how I can tell if I'm reading a crappy book, is if I'm skim reading pages of conversation.
And the problem is you might miss something that's important. And another tip, which is this is a more technical thing, just because I wanted to offer something for people to think about that was two quite different things. So this is to watch your tags. So things like said, replied, asked, snapped. And said is a great tag because it's used so often that I always think it's almost invisible. I'm not saying writers shouldn't use anything but said, but sometimes something like a whispered or a hissed or a barked can be perfect. But said in the main is safe, and problematic tags like opined or commanded, they can feel they can feel showy or mumbled. Mumbled. The other thing is what they can often do is that they can end up repeating the dialogue itself. So if you've got well-written dialogue that shows that an order is being given, you don't need the tag ordered. And showy speech tags, I think, can end up focusing the reader on the tag rather than on the actual speech, and usually we need the reader's attention on the speech that is driving the story forward. And some tags or less experienced authors use often don't even describe speech, so it could be snarled or just go over there, he snarled. Go over there, he gestured, and or groaned. That's another one that crops up. And I do see those slipping in and being used as dialogue tags when actually they're better as sometimes action beats. If you want to break up your dialogue and give the reader a little bit of a sense. Actually, I said I'd give 2 tips. I'm going to give a third one because it leads on to that. The other thing is to watch out for what some people call talking head syndrome. And that's where you've got just pages and pages of dialogue and the reader is lost in this void where there's only mouths talking and there's no sense of environment, there's no sense of movement. And sometimes you can, if you've got a lot of dialogue, and some novels are dialogue driven, but it doesn't always need to be the dialogue in quotation marks. Sometimes you can have implied dialogue, so you can turn a piece of dialogue into narrative, and the implication is that the person said this stuff. It's like a kind of summary of what they said. It's the same information, but it just mixes it up a little bit so that you haven't got people speaking and speaking and speaking. You can have it in narrative form as well, and then writers can add in action beats that give a sense of how the characters are moving, or what else is happening in the space around where that speaking is taking place. Dialogue is wonderful, but novels have a setting. They have a space in which they're operating, a world in which they're operating, and so I think there needs to be. It's unusual for that if your dialogue's gone on for pages and pages and pages, I think you need to sort of stop and ask yourself: does all of it need to be there? Could it be conveyed in a different way, so that the reader remembers that they are in a room or by the beach or somewhere? So those are my 3
Not
tips.
too much of a good thing. I think you're
anything.
Right.
Yeah, not like anything. It's a balance, isn't it?
So moving away from those things now, as I get the book, everyone, Editing Fiction at Sentence Level, and you'll find all sorts of nuggets of brilliance to help you construct your story. But I wanted to ask, and I know some of these things will be covered that we've already talked about, but what are the most common corrections that you find yourself making in an edit?
So aside from those things that we talked about, told prose, filter words, mundane dialogue that isn't driving the story forward, viewpoint drops. Another big one is overusing adverbs. And I think that's
get rid of them. Oh my God, get rid of them.
Under that sort of umbrella of using too many words. And as a line editor, I do spend a lot of time trying to help my clients convey more with less. Yes. So sometimes, and it's what Whitten said before about Learning, if you're a writer, to trust your reader, that fewer words will be
Yes,
just as
yes.
effective.
Oh my God,
Believe
Louise,
that
you are like you are. I talk about this all the time. It's
Yeah.
like, don't spoon feed us.
Yeah.
We are intelligent.
Yeah. So an example would be, so I come across a lot of suddenlies and immediatelys in my work, and sometimes you need to take a look as an editor and decide, or as a self-editor, if you're doing it yourself as a writer, decide whether those adverbs can be removed without damaging the prose. So if you're putting down something like suddenly Joe slammed on the brakes, then perhaps the verb slammed is doing the work as suddenly. It's not necessary. You've already got the speed in the verb, the immediacy of it. So that's something that I do a lot. And again, sometimes there's a time and a place for an adverb or an adverbial phrase. That's what you need. And actually without it, you won't get quite a same feel. But I think they're worth considering. That's what I always do. I consider it, and I think, what happens if I was to remove that for my client? Would it damage the prose? If it doesn't damage the prose, then we need to consider whether it needs to be there. But if it does damage it, then it stays. So I don't like to be prescriptive about these things, but I think sort of that those are the kind of main things. I mean, it really is a mixture. I mean, every writer I've ever worked with has strengths, but the things they struggle with are different, and that's kind of why the job's so interesting. Like I met a client who's really, really great at writing really tasty dialogue, just nails it, but then they might come unstuck when it comes to action scenes. So like keeping an action. Something I think that newer writers often need help with is looking at the rhythm and pace of a sentence. So can you show the tension perhaps in a scene by shortening the sentences or using punctuation that makes the sentences quite staccato so that they almost mirror the tension or can you make a sentence more florid in order to show rather than tell a different kind of mood, So small changes with punctuation can have mighty impacts on sentences and whether they come across as choppy or longer and more prosaic, and then that can mirror the mood. So if you've got an action scene, it's got lots of really long sentences in it and quite a lot of description, then your reader's brain isn't allowed to work at the speed as that fight's taking place. So when if something's like wham wham bam, and people are kicking each other and stuff, then the sentences need to kind of reflect that. Otherwise, the reader's falling asleep through an escape scene or whatever. So that's another thing that I deal with a lot: rhythm and pace.
Yes, I'm always talking about rhythm.
and once there are some neat little tricks that you can use that any writer can master as long as once they know what they are. So things like polysyndeton and asyndeton and anaphora and some less experienced writers might not have heard those terms before just because they haven't. And then once they see it, they'll go, oh yeah, that's what it's called. Oh, I can do that. I can change that sentence in 30 seconds. I can use that as a tool to make my prose more engaging or whatever. So anyway, it's in the book.
Oh, I was going to say, what are they? But no, if you leave it with that cliffhanger of it's in the book for sure. So if you find the most common corrections, then these things that you've just described, what are the ones you think make it obvious that the writer hasn't done the research?
I think I've had the odd situation where I've had a client write from the perspective of someone with a different lived experience, whether that's been a racial group or belief system or gender identity or sexual orientation or body type. And I've had to flag up an alert that something might be worth checking. So it might be asking them to think about the language they've used and how well it travels, or whether that character's experience would be authentic.
Men writing as women, I struggle with sometimes because they use the cliches, and you're just like, oh God, you're coming out with that cliche. That's not how we think. It's maybe how you think we think, but it really isn't.
But I think the opposite can happen as well. Women writing as men, or straight people writing as gay people, or white people writing as people of color, or able-bodied people writing as people with disability. So it's just that kind of thing I sometimes might flag up. Another example is I once worked with a client who used the word, a British writer, who used the word thug to describe a character, or had a character describe another character as a thug. And his book was set in the UK and had British characters. And over in Britain, you know, that word isn't racially charged, but it is in some parts of the world. And so it wasn't really a case that he hadn't done his research as such. It was just that he hadn't come across this information that I had. And so because he wanted his book to sell globally, we just talked through some different descriptors he might consider and why. And so it wasn't about research more, it's just about expanding his knowledge. Sometimes I also come up with people who haven't done their research on weaponry in my field. So you might have an author attaching a suppressor to a model of gun that can't take a silencer or something like that. I mean, that sort of real life world building is something I think all editors need to be on the alert for, but that doesn't necessarily mean they ought to necessarily change something if it's fiction. So I mean, if the building the author's assigned 43 floors to in real life only has 42, does it matter? Is the wording of the Miranda warning the cops given out in a book correct for the historical setting? Maybe that does matter, particularly if it's the kind of book that former or current or former cops might be reading,
or saying the words over and out when they never say over and out. Just over.
Yeah.
You know, it's like those little things that, you know, depending, I guess, on if it's a police
procedural,
military procedural, then anyone that's going to be picking up that book who's obviously got an interest in military are going to know they haven't done the research because they don't say that, you know.
I mean, you can get away with a lot more when you're writing, obviously, sci-fi and fantasy. But as soon as you get into any kind of form of novel that's got some sort of procedural elements to it, that there's a good chance the readers are going to have that too. You don't want to give them something to gripe about. I once had to ask a client to go away and check on some physics because the speed of light was too slow. I mean, really too slow. And it's little things like that probably most people have got enough of a grounding in, even if it's just school physics. They probably... It was a short story written and it was gorgeous. And that little thing just
discredit it.
So,
discredit
and he hadn't looked it up, and it was easy to sort out. So
exactly.
So
that reminds me of years and years ago when I was a child and had a big crush on David Cassidy.
I remember.
There was a David Cassidy song. I think it was called "Didn't We Have Ourselves Some Kind of a Summer?" Anyway. And I wrote a short story, and this is as a child, never having been to America. And I put something like, we stopped at one of the little roadside cafes that were so common around this part of America. And I had never been to America. I had no concept of how big it was, how you might say that about, one of the little roadside cafes that was so common around this part of Devon. But
yeah. Just expanding that to the whole of America. You've just reminded me of an example. I used to be I was a massive Clive Barker fan, the horror writer, and he wrote this a couple of books. Again, so long ago I read them, can't even remember them. But the crux of one of these, and this issue that came up in the big sort of denouement was this issue that it turned out two people were twins, and the reason why some DNA thing or other hadn't been detected was because they were identical twins, and all well and good. Only I immediately thought, yes, but the twins are a boy and girl. They're fraternal twins.
So they can't be identical twins.
They're not the same eggs. They're just like siblings. They're not the regular siblings. And he hadn't.
Oh my God.
Just hadn't. And I remember getting to the end of this book and going, that's it. That's your big twist. And now you've messed it up. Threw the book across the room. But then forgave him because
that's frustrating because that is a climax.
Well, maybe his editor should have. That's what editors are for there as well. Like you hope that. I think that all authors hope, especially if they're going through an editorial process and not doing it all by themselves, that by the time the commissioning editor has had a look at it, the agent, the structural editor, the line editor, the copy editor, the proofreader, the typesetter, their mum, three of their friends, one of you will pick up stuff like that. But sometimes everybody misses it.
That's crazy. That's leads us quite nicely then into the next question.
Would you ever agree to line edit a book that hasn't had a structural edit first? And why or why not?
Yeah, sure, I would. Some authors have nailed that skill. And even though they haven't hired an editor to do that kind of developmental work, it's not necessarily because they're really good structural self-editor or writer. I have quite a few clients like that who just think, that's their strength, actually, storytelling. It's their line craft that needs help. There are, of course, some on the flip side, there are people who've come to me and asked for me to line edit for them. And I've recommended that based on the sample, I think they need a structural edit before I go anywhere near it. I've also had people where I've said to them, I think you're ready for proofreading, and that actually a line edit would be, your line craft is so good that actually you'd be spending money when it's good enough.
What do you love most about what you do?
First, that my favorite genres to read are crime, thrillers, and mysteries, and I get to edit those 5 days a week. But also, I love creating. We had a chat about this before we started recording. I love creating resources, blogs, books, courses that help writers and editors learn about the magic of line craft, because a great line can elevate a story from okay to amazing. It really can. And, Whitney, you said this about dialogue, but actually, that same principle applies to other sentences within that novel. If you've got a great story, a superb plot, a wonderful setting, fantastic twist at the end, but the reader has to wade through mountains of words to get to it, then you'll lose your reader. And so it's really important that that's what I love. I love a sentence.
And have you worked on any books that took you by surprise? Either they didn't do well or did better than you think? Do you know how they go on to do afterwards?
Most of the time, no. I mean, I've had authors who've written what I think are amazing books and are by the time we've finished working together are where they need to be, and yet they've wanted a publishing deal and they've struggled to get it. But that doesn't surprise me. It's a hard thing to get.
Yeah.
And that's, like we were talking about this before, again, that's what I love about the indie publishing market. It doesn't matter. Some of my clients make a living from writing, even though they don't have a publishing deal. They're great writers, but they're great marketers too. And they've embraced that whole process of publishing. And I suppose that's the thing, isn't it? If you're an indie author and you're self-publishing, that's the word, publishing. You're not just writing. You're also responsible for your marketing, for your book design, your blurb writing, the distribution, the whole thing. So if you could, the ones that I know have made the most success are the ones who've really nailed that whole package. They've got great websites that are exciting to read, and that those little things like offering a novella for free to draw people in. I mean, there are all sorts of tips about how to get the best from Amazon and KDP. That's not my wheelhouse, but I think
it's hard though. It's really hard. I mean, I get a lot of requests I do the typesetting bit and the covers and bringing the book together, but I don't really get involved in the marketing side of things, although that's what a lot of people obviously ask our help with, because that's not what we do. But it's a relentless job. I mean, it's a full-time job. It's something you have to do all the time. And I think first-time authors don't appreciate, and we talk about this quite a lot, that, before you sit down and write one word, have a think about how you're going to sell it, where you're going to sell it, who's your target audience, where are they? Once you've invested in this book, how are you then going to get it into your ideal readers' mitts? Like, how do you do it? And some people haven't even given that any thought. They just think it happens somehow. They just think, oh, I'll whack it on Amazon and I'll make £1 million. And it's like, do you know how many other million of other people think exactly the same thing? And they don't give it any thought, which is something that Kylie Dixon talks about a lot in her. She's an author that we've worked with, and she's nailed her target reader. She's nailed her marketing, and she sold a hell of a lot of books, but she's also making a spotlight for Northeast authors, not just children's authors, but all sorts of authors. And I think when you know your market and you know who you're writing to, which you should know before you start writing, that's going to make a big, big difference with the success of your book, because you've got your marketing sorted.
That's right. You don't want to spend, I mean, marketing can be expensive. And if you if you aren't able to refine it, you're going to have to spend an awful lot of money to get to the right people.
Yeah.
So actually investing time in learning about that. And there's lots and lots of advice that authors can go to online, obviously, but a good place to start is the Alliance for Independent Authors, because they've got tons of resources. I think you're right. You know, there's not, I mean, look, if your aim is just to self-publish and know you can see the thing on your bookshelf, fine. But if you want to make a living from it,
it's a full-time job. Yeah, it's a full-time job.
Writing is not enough.
I think they say that in order to make a decent return, certainly on Amazon, and we all know that Amazon take a massive, massive percentage of your book cover, you need about 25 books that you're marketing regularly. But anyway.
And like some authors I know, they have a newsletter, so they're constantly building up their own bank of their
fans.
They're building their fan base right on their homeland, right on their home turf, not on Amazon's turf.
Yes.
So, I have a client, when he puts out a new book, he's got like 10,000 people on his mailing. They're the people who get to hear about it first. And that's 10,000 sales.
Direct sales. Yeah, exactly.
So
Facebook groups and selling directly is the way to go for sure.
Yeah.
Right, we must wrap up because we have been chatting. I mean, this episode's awesome. It's going to be the go-to episode now for people who are first-time authors who want to know how to start writing a book. So I'm going to thank you, but one last question.
Yeah.
And I know it's a biggie because you're just like, well, I could, talk for another hour. But if you had to really condense it down, what is the one bit of advice you would give those writers who are doing their first self-edit? Because there are a lot of people out there that think they can write the book, press the end, and then send to an editor.
Yeah.
And they can't. So what do they need to think about when they're self-editing?
I think my single best tip would be to focus on the order of editorial play. So don't try to line edit until you're happy with the structure, and don't try to polish with a proofread until you've worked on refining the line craft. So structure first, then line craft, then technical tidy up of copy editing, then final proofread, in that order. If you don't do it in that order, you're going to end up wasting time, because there's no point in getting every last I dotted and T crossed and every comma in the right place only to find out the plot doesn't work. Yeah. And you don't want to spend time refining paragraphs, and so that you're showing rather than telling, and playing with rhythm of sentences only to decide that actually that paragraph's like not going to be in there after all. So, so do it in that order, like break your editing down into those chunks: structural, line craft, copy edit, proof, final quality control check.
Alexa, is that not music to your ears?
It really is. All of these things are music to my ears. Yes, I will go to bed tonight with it all playing in my head.
Well, it's been such fun. Thank you so much for having me.
You're just such, as I said, a guru. It's like, who will know the answer to that? I know.
Yes, indeed.
Because you've gone into everything with such detail in your own reading and in your training, and then you've not kept it to yourself. You've produced courses and resources so that we all get to benefit from your knowledge.
Oh, thank you. The one thing I just add though is that my way isn't always the only way. I always like to think of my books, and I'm a great one for trying to break things down into frameworks so that they're accessible. I hate complexity. I don't mind complexity, but I like making complexity doable, manageable. And so not everybody will always agree with the approach I take to it. And I certainly wouldn't want anybody reading any of my advice and thinking that that is the way and it is the only way and it must be done like that all of the time. I'm not a prescriptivist. I'm a descriptivist. And I think it's that stuff is there for your consideration.
Mm.
Louise, yeah, it's very sage advice.
Yes.
Thank you.
Very sage advice. And what is so nice is the fact that I agree with everything you say.
God, I can sleep tonight. Because that would have been sticky. Like when, I get that email tomorrow saying, actually, we've decided not to put that one out.
No, but it's
we forgot to press record. Oh dear, whoops.
But everything you've said is what Alexa and I, is what Tewkesbury and I,
Tewkesbury and Whitten.
Yeah, Tewkesbury and Whitten is what we talk about. Like, we talk about exactly the same thing that you're sharing. And it's nice to know that, we're not talking bollocks. We kind of know what we're talking about. But at the end of the day, and we always say this at the end of the day, we just want to make your book better.
Yeah.
Right? We just want to make your book better. And if you can take anything away from this episode, it's re-listen, make notes, and apply this stuff to your book. Apply what is being said to your book, because you might not necessarily see it. So that's why Tewkesbury always says, take a break, put it away for 3 months, come back, and then apply it with a new hat on, with
idea.
an objective hat on.
Yeah.
Because I think people get very precious.
Yeah.
And they're like, I have to keep that in. It's important. Nah, get rid.
Yeah.
Copy it and put it on another Word document, but it, the book doesn't need it. So anyway, thank you, Louise. You've been amazing.
Thank you.
You have. It's been so interesting. Well, I knew it would be, but it's been, even more than that. So thank you ever so much for your time and sharing your knowledge.
So Louise, just before we go, where can we find you? We'll put this all on your guest page, but just quickly, in case people don't have time to go onto the webpage, where can people find you?
Yep, my website address is harnby.co/fiction-editing.
And can you just spell your last name?
HARN for November, B for Beta, Y. I'm terrible at the Yankee Bravos and all that. I should know all those, shouldn't I?
And are you on any social media? Are you on Facebook? Are you on Instagram?
I'm on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days. Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, email.
Perfect.
I'm everywhere.
We'll put those links all on the show note page.
Thank you, my lovelies.
And go and download some of the stuff and the book. I'm going to go get the book.
Yes, and if you want to listen to another podcast about editing, the editing podcast is the one that Louise and Denise host, and I've loved it from the beginning.
Thank you, Louise, very much.
Thank you.
This is going to be a go-to episode for sure.
Fantastic. And thrilling to be on.
Next week, we're going to be talking to Paula Fowler, who is author of the Wizard and Beano series. So watch out for that one. But in the meantime, bye-bye from me.
And bye-bye from me. And bye-bye, Louise.
Bye-bye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Take care. Bye.